And he made a very compelling statement, and it is, neither threats nor pleadings can move a man unless they touch someone of his potential or actual selves. And so that just made me, perk my ears up, because that is something that we do here as persuasive communicators. Not that we're ever that blatant, of course, with threats and pleadings, but still, it was something that I thought really needed to be developed in a mass communication context. There are some other more contemporary accounts of this in psychology, notably the work of Ken Demery and colleagues on the active self-account of prime to behavior effects, but even that does not develop it in a mass communication framework. So I went ahead and I wrote a paper as a grad student, and it eventually became this peace income theory. And in it, I discussed this notion of activated self-concept, how there are many different selves. The ones that are accessible are the ones that guide behavior, and this varied accessibility as a function of communication and other types of cues that we might get from the environment. So the link here, let me back up just a moment. So the link here, I don't know if you can see that. Darn, this was a molten lava chocolate cake. So the link here to health communication, it just looks like I don't know, it's like tar in a dish. That wasn't the intended effect.
I knew what it was.
You knew what it was?
I knew what it was.
Awesome. I was a chocolate affair to remember, so I was thinking about chocolate. I had chocolate on my mind. So the point with health communication is that there are very many health issues about which we have competing senses of self. I view myself as in general, a very health-conscious person. I've lost my teeth and stuff like that. But at the same time, I'm a person who enjoys rich desserts. I love cooking. I love eating. And so when presented with that opportunity, these notions of self are both activated, and they're just kind of duke it out. So the potential here is for media to make, or communication experiences, to make the desired self-concept more accessible relative to the other ones, so it can outcompete. And so whatever can give that the edge is what we want to do in terms of shaping media messages. Okay, let me back up for just a moment. Okay, so I've discussed identity, so now I want to talk about willingness. So if you're like me, you sometimes want to, set the alarm clock a little earlier than usual, so you can, get a head start on your day, do some braiding, put something in the crock pot, But when that alarm clock rings at 5:30 in the morning, what do you end up doing? Well, if you're like me, you might push it 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 times until it's finally time to really get up, otherwise you'll be late, right? So the point here is that willingness does not equal intention. You obviously intend to get up at 5:30, but that's not what you end up doing. So willingness, as opposed to intention, is what guides behavior when there's little time or motivation or opportunity to be thoughtful, and when the behavior is easy, expected, and attractive. So when you're there curled under the covers, is there, motivation to be thoughtful? Well, no, because you're half asleep, right? Is the behavior easy? Is it easy to stay in bed? Well, yes, because there's nothing you have to do, right? Is it expected? Yes, because everyone else is still asleep and there's no sense, getting them all up and disturbing them from their slumber. And finally, is it attractive? I think the answer to that is clear. And so there I am just pushing that button. But anyway, so willingness has been studied primarily in the health psychology literature, and it's conceptualized as an openness engage in risky behavior. So I use sleep as an example, but it's been studied in other contexts as well. And the main point is that it's a pathway to behavior that's not reasoned, but is rather more reactive and non-deliberative. You don't think about it. Okay, so in terms of relevance to health communication, some behaviors can certainly be portrayed by the media and by other social situations as easy, expected, and attractive, such as maybe being at a party and getting offers to to drink or whatnot. But by the same token, there's the potential for health messages to frame the advocated behavior as the easy, expected, and attractive thing to do. So that's the opportunity there for health communication. So now we have to put it together into a model of media effects, right? So we can study it. So I've already argued that communication can impact willingness, and also that it can impact accessible self-concept. But the key argument of William James and others is that self-concept accessibility is the mechanism via which communication has the effective behavior. So this is a model of mediation, of identity serving as a mechanism, as an explanatory mechanism for media effects, or communication effects.
Nori, could I ask a quick question, please?
Yes.
Now, what about an individual difference variable like sensation seeking? For example, it should be quite related to some of the aspects of willingness. So would that be something which would be part of the makeup of identity, or would that be something which would be separate?
I think you could conceptualize that as a self-concept. I haven't seen it studied as such. Usually it's just defined as a trait or whatever.
Trait, that's why I'm asking. So would that be something which could be brought into the conceptualization of identity, or would that be something in addition to identity?
Yes, I think it could be. I mean, you could certainly measure it, define it and measure it as such. And I'll talk about a non-user self-concept, which, may be related. I mean, that's something I'm still exploring. Any other questions from anyone else?
Yes, you mentioned accessibility of identity. Is that where you're in this model? When you say identity, do you mean how accessible it is, or do you mean the strength of identification?
Yes, accessibility. How salient, how top of mind it is. I do talk about in my other model I'm going to present about the value or the weight of accessibility as a predictor of behavior. So that's something I'll get to your. We'll hold off on that for just a moment. Okay, so before going further, though, I'm going to slip into teacher self-concept for a moment here. I want to ask why study mechanism? Is it enough to be just intensely curious? And for me, that's sufficient. But why else do we study mechanism? And here I'm going to ask Shri students, the grad students, what have you all learned about why study mechanism?
Well, if you know how it works, then you can change it, change the outcome, how the outcome's achieved.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, if you have a successful intervention or whatever, then you can replicate it. If it goes wrong, then you can figure out why. So yeah, I mean, it's not just important to know whether, but also how in the process. So, okay, good. So that's why, we go through all of this stuff. And particularly, I'm studying these psychological mechanisms. And there's an article by Daniel O'Keefe that argues that psychological mechanisms linked to message features are what really enable you to study media effects in a way that's meaningful to message design and evaluation. So once again, linking those two things together. Okay, there's an exciting measurement aspect to all of this also. But I'm just going to ask you to stay tuned for that. I won't get to that until I talk about my actual dissertation. But first, let me just go over some preliminary evidence in support of the self-concept activation. I did a study of print drug prevention PSAs, and it turned out that the PSAs that were successful in the field at changing behavior were the ones that in the lab were most successful at activating a non-user self-concept and lowering willingness to use substances. But that piece is right now at the Journal of Health, will be out soon in Journal of Health Communication. So I did not, though, formally hypothesize this mediating relationship because I was still kind of early in the stages of developing this model. But I did test it in post hoc analysis, and lo and behold, that analysis did find that there was a significant indirect effect of exposure on willingness via self-concept activation. But, that's not enough. I need to take that next step and formally propose and test the hypothesis, which is what I did for my dissertation. Okay. So my dissertation has been accepted to ICA, and I'm going to present it there. And whereas the first study I did used print drug prevention messages, this one used video PSAs produced by the Office of National Drug Control Policy for their long-term media prevention campaign. And the key prediction was, again, this mechanism of self-concept accessibility, mediating the effect of exposure on willingness. Let me talk about the stimulus pool for just a moment. I used ONDCP TV ads that were produced, from 2000 to, I guess, last year. And the ONDCP's efforts have not been shown to produce a whole lot of success in the field. There are a lot of mixed results, ads, backfiring in some cases. So, so this is a chance to help shed light on why the campaign, had this, null or negative effect. So this was a very heterogeneous pool of ads, though. I mean, just ads that was very widely in terms of theme and execution. But I needed to capture an ad feature that could be manipulated, so I chose to run a pretest and ask participants to categorize the ads based on the theme. In addition to that, I also wanted to find unambiguous exemplars of theme, ads that would be categorized in one theme pretty clearly and not in others. So it would be, I tried to make as clean a manipulation as possible. So what finally emerged are two different themes, and the themes were marijuana non-use supporting autonomy. If I don't use marijuana, I can, make decisions, live my own life, etc. And non-use supporting responsibility. If I don't use marijuana, I'll be a more responsible, friend, team member, sibling, etc. I'll keep my promises to people who are important to me. So these stimuli were embedded into an 8-minute clip of Wheel of Fortune, America's Game. This might sound kooky, but it's actually been used as, or embedding ads in game show clips has been used in some advertising research. So that's why I chose Wheel of Fortune. Pat Sajak is such an inoffensive and pleasant host, so there would be nothing, not a whole lot to ruin the effect of the ad. So the ads were just kind of swapped. I kind of swapped the commercials with the ads, such that they replaced the last 30-second ad in each of 2 commercial breaks. And then the control clip just retained all the original commercials. And so the length was the same. So the design was very simple. It was a post-test only design, a 3-level design with random assignment to one of those 3 conditions. Exposure to messages about non-use supporting autonomy, and then about non-use supporting responsibility, and finally the control condition. So here were the measures I used. The 2 main ones were self-use and non-user, and behavioral willingness to use marijuana. Those are my key outcomes. I also had 2 other outcomes: perceptions of marijuana uses inconsistent with autonomy and responsibility. So I promised a very exciting measurement section, and here it is. I used the approach of reaction time measures of accessibility. And this had the advantage of being able to capture very finely with a lot of variation how accessible a particular concept was. These are measures that were adapted from psychology, most notably in terms of activating the self. And the outcome is not necessarily well, the participants were presented with a speeded, dichotomous judgment task. They have to answer yes, no, very quickly. And so, for example, to measure self-concept accessibility, we would ask them whether the trait or the attribute druggy, for instance, described them. And they would answer yes or no. So most people would say no, but that's not really what we were concerned about. It was the time to respond to no. That was a key outcome of interest. So there's more to this than that. There's also data cleaning and analysis details, but I won't go over that here, but we can talk about it later if you're interested. I also use this approach to measure behavioral willingness. And I want to talk about this a little bit because it's something I'm going to expand on in the future. Behavioral willingness, the traditional measure, is something that takes a lot of thought to complete. And that struck me as very inconsistent with the conceptualization of willingness as kind of a reactive, non-reasoned approach. So I used a reaction time measure here, and it's the first time it had ever been used, so I was hoping that it would work out. Well, I used it in my previous study, but still the contribution is that this is a new approach to measuring willingness, and so far it's held up as an outcome pretty well. So the results are that relative to the control condition, the ads that had the responsibility theme, they slowed reaction times to endorse the self as a non-user, inconsistency of marijuana with responsibility, and unwillingness to use marijuana. So these ads are backfiring, right? But that wasn't my main concern. My main concern was the mechanism, right? So I went ahead and tested this. I tested this in a multiple mediation model in which the non-user self-concept accessibility was the key mediator of interest. And I pitted it against a competing potential mediator of marijuana not supporting responsibility. So as predicted, we did find, or I found, significant indirect effects through this path right here, but not through this path right here. So that, taken together, it shows that it's, pretty promising explanatory mechanism for the effects of theme on willingness. Okay? So in terms of the theoretical contributions, this was the first formal test of this hypothesized relationship that I was aware of anyway. And it's combined with the other work that I've done. I think it's good evidence that the self-concept activation mechanism is has a lot of explanatory value for health communication. In terms of practical contributions, it sheds light on the ONDCP campaign, and it provides a new campaign evaluation tool that people can use maybe in the pre-test stages before ads are deployed to see whether ads get them at that visceral gut level. And in terms of willingness, I guess maybe I seem like a method geek or something like that, but what really bothers me, I'm not. What really bothers me is when a concept doesn't match the measure, and so that's why I've been pushing hard on establishing this behavior willingness reaction time measure. It still needs to go through more formal reliability and validity testing, so I've gotten a URC grant to do that, hopefully the beginning of the fall. And that will allow me to test applications in other health situations such as risky sexual behaviors and tobacco use. So it would allow me to expand that construct even more. Okay, Finally, how am I doing on time, Sheree? Am I doing okay?
Plenty of time. You have 30 minutes.
Are there any questions at this point before I launch into my next thing? Yes.
Did the autonomy ads have any effect?
The what?
The autonomy ads? You talked
No,
about
they were
responsibility.
about the same as control. Yeah, so I mean, they just didn't have much effect. Yeah.
Based on your knowledge of the other kind of self-concept activation stuff in other dimensions, what's the idea of the duration of this kind of effect? I mean, is this like a short-term prime caused by the ad? Do you know of any studies that have looked at how long it takes for that effect to dissipate?
Yeah, the only one that I know of has been work by Russ Fazio and his colleagues. They did do some priming. They do work with evaluative conditioning, which is kind of priming that is similar to that. And they did find that effects persisted even after 2 weeks. And so this was a relatively subtle manipulation. I mean, they were seeing 2 30-second ads. So if you think about it, if they're repeatedly exposed to these ads, they see it on TV, and if it's just, more, if they see it, a few times a week, it could accumulate into something that is even more permanent, such that when someone is in a position of decision making, there might be something that sticks in their mind and gives the edge to the advocated self-concept or something like that. That's a good question, though. I mean, and I struggle with that too, and maybe you did too, Sherita, dealing with, activation, priming, all of these things that are, even subconscious priming. How persistent, how substantive are they, if it's beyond consciousness and things like that. So that's a good question. Still working on it.
So the underlying idea is essentially what you're trying to do is make people more likely to have a reaction that says, I'm not the kind of person who does that.
Yes.
Or I am the kind of person who does that.
Yes, yeah, at the gut level.
Yeah, without even thinking about it. You
Right.
want to make them think, I'm the person who's willing to do that or not willing to do that
Yeah,
in
yes.
the crunch moment.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, absolutely. And that's pretty tough, but
Yeah,
even with subtle manipulations, you get a little effect. So
Mm-hmm.
it's possible with other more environmental coordinated efforts, it could be even stronger.
Have you thought about using other DVs beyond behavioral willingness?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, well, in a mediated model, you have, at least those two that are outcomes. Yeah, I mean, there's always, perceptions about norms and things like that. There's David Wilson is doing work on norm accessibility. So there are other things that could be measured, at the level of accessibility that aren't just about the self, but are more about, perceptions of social group norms in the environment and things like that. Did you have any good candidates in mind, or?
No, I mean, ultimately, I guess, we're going to be looking at it in terms of getting some funding or something like that. We'll potentially be looking at, for example, when we're talking about tobacco use, in terms of whether this could lead to any changes in cessation.
Yes. Well, for sure, behavior willingness to use tobacco, to engage in risky behaviors, maybe do some
actual
collaboration.
use of,
Oh, an actual use? Well, yeah, I'm working towards that. I'd like to eventually look at actual behavior in the field. And so, yeah, that's something I'm working towards. I'm still kind of in the lab at the moment, but I know that that's the eventual
I think that would
goal.
also go some ways towards answering Bart's question too, in terms of how ephemeral these effects are.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so that's a goal for the future. I have another theoretical goal, and that is to propose an even more elaborate model of identity. It's something I've been working on in the past several months, and I call it the Prism Model. That graphic, by the way, is courtesy of Scott Parrott. That's his handiwork over there. Okay, so this is, well, let me back up for a second. I'm not that practiced in presenting about it yet because, it's still really new. But at the same time, I think it's, potentially, one of the more provocative things today that I'll talk about because it's got a lot of possibilities for strategy and for testing, in studies. So the basic idea is that identity can be both a mediator and a moderator of effects of communication. And this is going to be a book chapter in a forthcoming volume called Social Identity in Media, New Agendas in Communication Research. And when I talk about identity as a moderator, I mean that it can change the effect of communication on a behavior. In that sense, it can alter that effect. And when I say that it's a mediator, it's the same relationship that I've talked about this whole time, about it serving as a conduit of the effect of communication behavior, as an explanatory mechanism. And it struck me as I was thinking about these dual roles that it was analogous to what a prism might do, when you hold it up in a beam of light. So, in one sense, the prism can be seen as a moderator of the effect of the light source because it's got these angled sides and it can, send out the beam in different but predictable angles. But at the same time, you can also see it as a conduit of the light source, of the light coming from the source, because unless that prism is there, it's not going to get to, the opposite wall. So in that sense, it mediates the effect of the light source. So both of these seem to be, pretty analogous to these roles of, of communication. And I came to this, this realization because as a grad student, I just went through all of these studies about identity, and I know Shireen, is, doing the same thing and feeling overwhelmed and bogged down and all of that stuff. So I saw all of these studies about identity serving as a moderator of the effects of communication, and that, depending on level of ethnic identification, this ad would have a stronger effect on behavior. So that's identity as a moderator, right? And then there was my own work on identity as a mediator. Also, at the same time, I was reading about these major theoretical perspectives, the social identity perspective, the multiple selves perspective of William James that I just talked about. And both of these offer very similar views of identity. Identity is composed of multiple components that differ in accessibility and value, and that are context sensitive. So this all made sense. And so I said, well, geez, I need to put in a model that I can study communication. And so that's how I came up with the Prism model. And so maybe that seems just kind of abstract, so maybe, we do some box and arrow path models that might make it more concrete. So it basically looks like a combination of mediation and moderation. So here's the mediating relationship that we've been talking about, with identity serving as the conduit of the effects of communication and behavior. It's mediation. And here's moderation, where it changes the effect of communication on behavior. So if you put it in a pot, you mix it all together, you come up with the Prism model. And you see that moderating path there, changing the effect of communication and behavior. So there's actually an alternative depiction of the Prism model based on the two different ways you can represent moderation, right? So if you're saying that identity moderates the effect of communication, it's also true that the reverse is also true, that communication moderates the effect of identity. They moderate each other. They interact, right? The effect of one depends on the value of the other. So this model right here is mathematically or statistically the same as this model. Okay, so you take that, then you add the mediation model, mix it all together, and then you come up with this model of, or this alternative depiction of the Prism model. And so you have these two different views. They're mathematically equivalent. And the choice of one or the other kind of depends on what you want to study. So even that might seem a little abstract, so let me use another example. Do y'all know about the Truth Campaign and the shards of glass? Okay. Do you want to explain shards of glass for people who don't know?
Well, it's this kind of tongue-in-cheek commercial where the CEO is speaking about his company, Shards of Glass, which makes popsicles with pieces of glass in them. And he's sort of kind of talking as if he was a tobacco executive, saying, we've recently understood that our shards of glass may have been harmful to some people if not properly used.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, it's a really funny campaign, actually. I'm just using this as an example. So a shards of glass ad, or this graphic right here, it can increase the accessibility of an identity as a young person or as youthful. It's got all sorts of cues there. It's got popsicle, cute little smiley face. So all of these cues can make more accessible an identity or a self-concept, even for the moment, as a younger person, as a more youthful person. At the same time, it increases the value of that identity as a predictor of non-smoking. And it does so by tying non-smoking as, very closely to, being a rebellious youth, fighting, against the evil forces of big tobacco. So by linking that behavior to that self-concept, and by kind of glamorizing that self-concept, it increases the value of that identity as a predictor of non-smoking. So if you want to go back to, so it kind of is the second model right here, in that it increases the accessibility of the mediating path, but it also increases the value of identity as a predictor, such that ads that are not successful at bringing up this youthful identity and not tying non-smoking to this identity will not be successful at impacting behavior. So I hope that makes sense. I need more practice explaining this stuff with more examples, but that's my best shot for now. In terms of design implications, I hope this model, will be useful for more than, for more people than just those of us who do quantitative research. Some of the implications are to embed cues in your communication that elicit the desired identity. And then further on top of that, you can also kind of emphasize that identity as tied to the advocated behavior. And in that sense, you help it outcompete the potentially conflicting self-concepts. And finally, you would link the advocated behavior very tightly with that self-concept. So, in terms of analysis, there are statistical tools that allow you to test these relationships. In particular, there's an SPSS macro that tests models of moderated mediation, which is what this is. And I do have some future research planned to test these proposed relationships. Lots of future research here. So to sum up the Prism model, it integrates propositions about identity that have come from major theoretical perspectives in psychology, but it puts it in a form that we can study here in communication. It conceptualizes identity as having a complex intervening role that takes into account both moderation and mediation. And I think this could be summed up in the metaphor of a prism. And finally, I hope it's useful for more people than just quant researchers. And actually, this brings me to the end of my story. I hope it's clear that all of us, are on a quest when we do research. Mine was characterized by a lot of, WTF and aha moments in my graduate program. And in my search to, reconcile these discrepancies, I embarked on adventures through unmapped territories, these new measures and models and stuff like that. It's actually really hard to get those past reviewers at some point. And then bringing me to discovery, glittering diamonds in the light. And finally, all of this, brings up just the need for more research to test these models, to further validate these measures. So all of that lies ahead. So I'm going to end there, but I welcome your questions and comments, especially for the new stuff on the Prism model and for anything. And I'm also going to use this opportunity to shamelessly ask for collaborators, because you need companions on the journey. And so if you're interested in any of this, either identity, regardless of your methodological perspective, or if you're in health comm, all of this has potential to apply to health comm. It's one of the toughest persuasive challenges ever. Or if you're if you like the whole analysis side with the methods and measures and analysis side, please come and talk to me afterwards. So I think I'll end there, and thank you all for for coming to my talk. Any questions? Joe Bob?
Can you go back to the slide where you showed the two models, the two versions of the same model?
Yes.
And I really like the Prism as a metaphor. I think that explains, especially to someone who doesn't necessarily know mediation moderation. But when you show these two different versions of the same model, the Prism almost gets the top one.
What do you mean by that?
Well, as a metaphor for the model.
Oh, okay.
Because of the way a prism works. And so that's just a little confusing.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, identity is a prism, but you're right, the second one. Well, yeah, you're right, that's a good point. It's not entirely perfect, it's not, doesn't fit quite that closely, but they are mathematically equivalent. And actually this top model here can be used to explain a lot of phenomena that we're interested in, like the spirals model well, I'm not really that prepared to talk about it, but if my advisor Mike Slater has proposed the spirals model. It's a mutually reinforcing model in which communication and behavior, the link gets strengthened over time. And so this model here kind of captures the increasing strength of that communication behavior link over time. So that's so they're both useful in different ways, but yeah, you're right that it's not the prism in the beam of light for the second one. Good call. Yes.
I'm impressed that you came up with this new area of research when you started this new program here. I think it's really amazing.
Oh, well, I'm older than most people too, so I've been thinking about these things for a long time.
But you said just in the last few months that the prism idea.
Well, actually, this came up in my candidacy, but I didn't actually submit a book chapter or write it up as a manuscript until this past summer. So it's just been several months that I've been thinking about it.
Do you remember you do this? So you must have it in your mind's eye, I guess, the prism.
Yeah.
Do you remember when you came up with that, like brainstorm?
Actually, I think it was in looking at these models because it struck me. Well, I was looking at mediation. If you look at them separately, they all kind of look like a prism. And so I said, well, you know what? You could just put these together, and that actually looks like a prism. But yet it also describes this thing that all of these other people are saying about the roles of identity. So, yeah, I don't know. Actually, when I've explained it before, people have thought I've said the prison model of identity. It's like, what does that say about you? But yeah. Thank you.
One of the things that occurs to me about this is, so something I read one time was talking about, so there's this New York Times editorial from about 5 years ago talking about what the woman learned about her marriage by hanging out with animal trainers.
Oh.
Yeah. And so one of the things she learned is like all the, sort of positive reinforcement and things that animal trainers use and to change behavior. And so she started using these things on her husband.
This is great.
And Sheila was like, aha!
Exactly.
Yes.
And everybody else in the room knows I am eventually going to get there. So, and one of the things she also learned as part of this was you're never going to stop a badger from digging. Right? So a badger has a fundamental drive to dig.
Yes.
That you are never going to be able to train out of the badger. right? Similar to a husband who has a fundamental drive to leave his socks on the floor. You're never going to train that out of them.
Yeah.
So what's occurring to me about this that's interesting is that in a way you've got to have, the identity has to be in there somewhere. The prism can make, you can't make somebody who's fundamentally a user encourage their non-user identity if the non-user identity isn't there.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
do you think of this as, I mean, there's nothing that could, there's no intervention that's going to make me a Walmart shopper or a Hummer driver, right? So do you think of this as sort of a low-hanging fruit strategy of if people are sort of on the fence, can you push them? Or do you think of this as like a...
Yeah, well, I think, well, first of all, these are great questions, and I'm curious to see that article. Maybe you can send me the link later.
Mm-hmm.
Let's think about, for instance, changing a committed smoker to a non-smoker.
Okay, yeah.
Okay. In the beginning, a smoker's self-concept, as a smoker, is going to be, ever present, always accessible. They have all the cues around, the packs of cigarettes are out and whatnot. But if they, if they enter a quitting program, and if they maybe go without smoking for a day, a few days, a week, they will start to develop perhaps a non-user self-concept. And so the point of whatever intervention it is, whether the media portion, the social interaction portion, is to strengthen that as the non-user self-concept as a competitor for the smoker self-concept. Eventually, as they start hanging around more non-smokers, it will get really solidified.
Mm-hmm.
But maybe they'll fall off the wagon at certain points, and so those two self-concepts will always be fighting.
Right.
And so the point there is to make one may be more valued,
Mm-hmm.
not just accessible, but more valued because they're they're both accessible because they're fighting, but to make one more valued. And so eventually, over time, you might see trading the digging out of the badger. I don't know, but people have switched identities.
Mhm.
I mean, it's not an instantaneous process,
Right.
but I think accumulated exposure over time to strengthen that, has potential to work.
When you describe it that way, it sounds like it could sort of fit into the stages of change model.
Yes.
And
yeah.
at certain points, it would there would be a point when this is the thing to insert.
Yes. Yeah.
Insert
Okay,
this
let's
here.
write a paper. Yeah, how
Yes.
different strategies for increasing accessibility and increasing value will change over time.
Mhm.
I mean, that's something I developed my chapter, but it's like a paragraph that it could certainly be
Mhm.
expanded into a paper.
Well, since you mentioned mediated, you mentioned moderated mediation, something you look at. Given that you want to explore models like that, do you see at any point it being useful to look at sort of separate measures of identity? I don't know if valence is the right word, but of sort of level of identification vis-a-vis the accessibility of that. So like when you're talking about the shards of glass triggering the youth stuff, that could trigger it in me, but that might be different than triggering, as a 31-year-old who wishes he were probably in his 20s. It might be different than triggering it in a 20-year-old.
Right. Yes, I think that you could look at separate measures, but I'm proposing that the same construct could serve simultaneously as a moderator. So if the same construct is serving as that role, it would have to be the same operationalization. I can't say that word. As well. I can talk to you later because I do, in my chapter, I do talk about this whole moderation idea here. It's kind of based on the the strength of identity as a predictor, so it's not really changing the conceptualization or operationalization of identity, but rather its strength as a predictor of the behavior.
So strength as a predictor,
Yeah,
but
strength as a
accessibility still would be the mediator, or would strength be the mediator as well?
Well, it would just be, you would measure accessibility of self-concept, but I'm proposing that accessibility would also have a different effect on behavior depending on some level of communication. I don't know if that makes sense, but but I can talk to you later about that. I try to describe in my chapter. It's based on some other reasoning from the work of, in HealthCom and other places.
Thanks.
I was just going to jump on what she was saying. You were typing, and I pulled up trans-theoretical model of change right before you said it. I'm like, oh, we're on the same wavelength.
There we go.
But based on your comment just now, what I was thinking about, what can be changed. So if you get into the pre-contemplation stage versus the contemplation stage, maybe that's where to insert it. But I think it has to be on some kind of behavior that can be changed, or some kind of self-concept that can be. Because I will never have the self-concept of being an African-American male. I will always, but I could change my concept about being a smoker versus a non-smoker.
Yes.
So it seems like there are limitations in terms of self-concept, but for those things that can be changed, I think the stages of change would be really interesting to.
Yes, yeah, I think so. That's a great point. Thanks.
What about multiple identities then, based on what we are discussing?
Multiple identities. Well, yes. I mean, I think that goes to the root of what I'm saying is that for lots of health issues, there are multiple identities. Like if you're, an adolescent, a teenager, you might view yourself in some situations as, the good kid, someone who's dutiful, who, does chores for their parents and things like that. But in a different situation, you might view yourself as more risk-taking and things like that. So I think, this model would suggest that if you, for instance, frame non-use, the healthy behaviors as something consistent with, the edgier or riskier, youth subculture maybe, then that would give it a chance to outcompete, or just be a stronger self-concept when they get out of those risky situations.
But then how would you explain the multiple communication modes?
Well, I don't think this model takes into account multiple communication modes. It's looking at manipulating.
But isn't that a reality of society that you have multiple
Yes, we're in a a saturated environment. There's lots of competing messages. Yeah, for sure. I think the way I try to do that, I mean, I don't think a model can explain everything, but the way I try to do that is, for instance, embedding the ads in a clip rather than a forced exposure point of view. It's more about multiple identities and multiple channels, but that certainly can be explored. You could look at different, different modes of communication and see how they play into that model. I don't know if that answers your question.
No, that's fine.
I didn't want to make it too complicated because, I like the parsimony of the Prism model and to add all sorts of other potential mediators and moderators and IVs and DVs to be would take away from the basic argument that I wanted to make of the dual roles of mediation and moderation.
So maybe you can put a refraction element of a prism.
Okay.
that explains all these outliers or inliers. I mean, a prism refracts in many ways.
Right.
Or it unites
blue,
the light.
the yellow.
I mean, you could get into several concepts of physics. I have to brush on them. But I think that would still sustain you on your prism model, but still explain what a prism does in terms of if you want to get through that metaphor.
Yeah. I mean, I think the cool thing with a prism metaphor is that it does get all of these juices flowing. You do look like at a prism, it's very concrete, and you could say, oh, well, this is how it works. But at the same time, there are limitations. It doesn't explain everything, as Joe Bob pointed out. It doesn't explain that second version that well. But yeah, it's a cool entry point anyway to the idea. Even if it doesn't explain absolutely everything about multiple identities and multiple channels. But yeah. Any other questions?
I don't have, it's not a question, it's just a suggestion. I was just thinking about the shards of glass example. And that seemed like a bit of a struggle.
Yeah. I'm still working on the way I present it. I just found that this morning. I was trying to think of a good way to present it.
I think what you need to find is a case where you have access to the account planner on the campaign, because it strikes me that the entire art of the account planner is doing advertising, looking for the insight that's going to be persuasive, is about tapping into people's self-identification.
Yeah.
And so if you could get information about how the campaign was developed, instead of looking at the post, here's the campaign and trying to explain it back. Get access to the research that led them to develop that campaign and show how it fits your model.
Aren't those proprietary usually?
Well, there's lots of case studies.
Okay, yeah, I guess with this campaign. Okay, I'll talk with you about that. That's great.
Kind of building up that, instead of putting the new identity as a seed in the mind that competes with who I am, I felt like this campaign probably had a defined target audience. And from that description of research, they described this audience's identity as this sort of young, stick-it-to-the-man kind of person. And they tried to associate a behavior or redefine that description of identity as of not smoking or sticking it to the man and not smoking. So, go ahead.
Well, I appreciate that insight. I think you're right. There is a defined target group out there. I think these ads are designed to appeal to maybe young people who view that group as an aspirational group, who aren't maybe necessarily in it, but who aspire to be part of that group. And so maybe in that sense, it does kind of plant the seed in their mind that, oh yeah, I can be one of those rebellious youth too, and I can do this by. So, you see what I'm saying? I mean, but certainly it would apply to them as well. People who already have that defined sense of self as a rebellious youth fighting against the forces of big tobacco. But for other people, the ones who are on the fence, who have an ambiguous and unformed identity, this could be the stimulus to kind of push them towards, a strong, well not a strong, but a non-user identity associated with a very desirable group, an aspirational group.
And also that argument belies the fact that a lot of these government-funded ad campaigns to promote healthier behavior have been total busts. And so the power of your model is to be able to evaluate sometimes why they were busts, and also, hopefully in the future to use as pretests to figure out, will this be a bust if we do it this way?
Right,
So I mean that's part of the thing, is that of course I think there's a lot of also like people sitting around in a boardroom and coming up with like, okay, we've read this research and here's our slogan and here's our angle, and not necessarily having the insight of using these theoretical models to make them successful, particularly with the anti-drug stuff. There's been a lot.
Yeah, I think that was a huge bust. And those ads were pre-tested. They were shown to move perceptions of marijuana harm in the lab. They were extensively pre-tested, but yet they bombed in the field. And so going back to the whole why do we study mechanism, it's clear then that it's not because they moved perceptions of harm. It's because there was some other psychological construct that they weren't tapping into, the whole notion of value, self, and all of that. So if they could just throw that in, the pre-test session, they might find different results, and it could just help inform, formative research before they deploy these to the field. Any other questions? I've really enjoyed your comments and discussions. Thank you.
Great presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you.